The offer arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped through my mail slot at exactly 7:43, tucked inside a cream-colored envelope so thick and expensive that it felt like holding a small brick. I knew what it was before I opened it. I had been waiting for it for 11 days. I set it on the kitchen counter next to my coffee, picked up my mug, and watched Mia through the window. She was in the backyard, crouched down near the fence, carefully transferring a caterpillar from the concrete path onto a leaf, talking to it in the low, serious voice she used when she believed something needed to be treated with great dignity. The morning light came through the oak tree in long, soft strips, and landed across her shoulders and the back of her neck, and she looked exactly the way a 10-year-old girl should look on a Tuesday morning in October. I let myself watch her for a full 30 seconds before I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, heavy stock, Shaw Realty Group letterhead in embossed navy ink. The letter informed me, in the careful, antiseptic language of a legal document that has been reviewed by at least 4 attorneys, that my property at 114 Elm Drive, Atlanta, Georgia, was being formally acquired under Georgia's Community Redevelopment Statute. The offered purchase price was $280,000. Market rate, the letter said. Fair and generous, the letter said. I had 30 days to sign and vacate, or the matter would proceed to court-ordered acquisition. At the bottom, a handwritten note in blue ink, added after the lawyers had finished their work. Claire, be reasonable. This is already decided. D.S. I folded the letter back into the envelope. I set the envelope down. I picked up my coffee. I took one slow sip. Then I opened the drawer beneath the kitchen counter, the one that held takeout menus and expired coupons and a spare set of keys to a car I no longer owned, and I reached past all of it to the false bottom. I had installed myself 6 years ago with a box cutter and a sheet of thin plywood and a tube of wood glue. I lifted the panel and took out the item underneath. A small notebook, black cover, no label. I set it on the counter beside the Shaw Realty envelope. I had started the notebook 19 days ago. The morning after, I noticed the gray Nissan Sentra parked at the end of Elm Drive, engine off, same spot, 2 different drivers in 4 days. A surveillance rotation so amateur it would have gotten someone reassigned in any competent operation, but competence had never been Derek Shaw's strongest quality. His strongest quality was money, and the particular species of confidence that money grows in men who have never once been genuinely outmatched. I opened the notebook to the first page. The page was covered in a grid of names, dates, arrows, and abbreviations that would look like meaningless shorthand to anyone who picked it up without knowing the key. To me, it was a map. Every piece of pressure Derek Shaw had applied in the past 3 weeks. Every asset he had deployed. Every angle he had used. The insurance company, the bank, the school, the neighbors, Vincent's appearance at the school gate, the community meeting, the planted question about my financial history, the whisper campaign through the HOA email list that I was not who I said I was. All of it was in the notebook. All of it was connected. I turned to the last page, the one with 3 items listed and 2 of them already checked. The 3rd item did not have a check mark yet. I picked up a pen. I looked at the Shaw Realty envelope on the counter. I thought about Mia outside, still talking to her caterpillar, still completely unaware that a man she had never met had decided that the yard she was crouching in and the house she slept in and every morning like this one were things he was entitled to take from her, simply because he had enough money, and enough lawyers and enough history of doing exactly this, to other families in other cities to believe that no one would ever find the seam where his empire was weakest. He had never been wrong before. He had never tried this with me before. I put the check mark on the 3rd item. Then I picked up my phone and made a call that had no business being made from a kitchen counter in a quiet suburb of Atlanta by a woman who was supposed to be a freelance accountant. The line connected on the 2nd ring. I said 3 words. It's time. Go. What happened next took 31 days and cost Derek Shaw everything he had spent 20 years building. But before I tell you how it ended, you need to understand how it started. Not the envelope. Not the gray Nissan on the street. Further back than that, you need to understand what kind of woman Derek Shaw decided to make his last mistake with, and why the most dangerous thing I ever learned to do was make people believe I was nobody. I spent 14 years working for an organization whose name I am still not permitted to say in certain rooms. What I can tell you is that my official job title The one on the business card I handed to people at conferences and dinner parties and the occasional congressional briefing was Senior Economic Analyst, Department of the Treasury. What I can tell you is that the actual work bore approximately the same relationship to economic analysis as a scalpel bears to a kitchen knife. They are both sharp. I was an intelligence officer. Strategic analysis, specifically the kind that does not involve guns or field operations or anything that looks like what you see in movies. My work happened in quiet rooms with bad lighting and excellent coffee, in front of screens filled with financial data and satellite imagery and intercept transcripts, building the kind of picture that allowed other people with more authority and more accountability than me, to make decisions that changed the shape of governments. I was good at it. I was, for a long time, one of the best. Which is not me being arrogant, because I was also one of the most invisible, and in that particular line of work, invisibility and excellence are the same thing. I left when Mia was 2 years old. I left for a reason I have never explained in full to anyone except my sister Grace, and even to Grace I only explained the edges of it, the parts that could be spoken without reopening something I had spent 3 years carefully closing. The short version is that there was an operation, and I was the analyst who built the intelligence picture that supported it. And the picture was right, in every technical sense, and 3 people died because of a variable that no picture can ever capture, which is the specific and terrible way that human beings choose to behave in the exact moment when the stakes are highest. The picture was right. The outcome was wrong. I carried that distinction home with me on a flight from a city I cannot name, and I sat in the arrivals hall of Hartsfield-Jackson with my go-bag between my feet and Mia's photograph in my jacket pocket, and I understood, with the clarity that only comes from a specific kind of exhaustion, that I was finished. I submitted my resignation 4 days later. My director asked me 3 times if I was certain. I said yes each time. He shook my hand and told me that if I ever changed my mind, the door was open. He said it the way people say things they mean, but hope will never be tested. I have not tested it. I moved to Atlanta because Grace was there, because the school district was good, because the house on Elm Drive had a backyard with an oak tree and a fence. I could paint any color I wanted, and because it was the kind of street where a woman could sit on her front porch in the evening and watch the neighborhood kids ride their bikes and feel, if not completely at peace, then at least at a distance from the things that peace had cost her. I built a life there. A real one, not a cover. I learned to make Mia's favorite pasta from scratch. I joined the library's Tuesday night book club and actually read the books. I let my neighbor Tom Henderson teach me how to properly prune the rose bushes along the fence, which took 4 sessions because I kept cutting too much, and he kept saying, with infinite patience, that you had to listen to the plant. I paid my property taxes on time. I drove Mia to school every morning and picked her up every afternoon, and I was present for all of it in a way I had never been able to be present for anything before, because for the first time in 14 years nobody needed me to disappear. And then Derek Shaw bought the 4 properties surrounding mine, and I understood that the disappearing was not finished with me yet. I first heard Derek Shaw's name from Grace 8 months before the envelope arrived. We were sitting at our kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, Mia asleep in the guest room, Grace's case files spread across the table between us and 2 glasses of wine that were getting warm because we kept forgetting to drink them. Grace was a real estate attorney, the kind who represented buyers and small landlords and the occasional nonprofit housing organization, and she had been watching Shaw Realty's expansion through the Southwest Atlanta corridor for 2 years by then. He finds a neighborhood on the edge, she said. Not a bad neighborhood, not a good one. The kind where the houses are a little older and the people have been there a long time and nobody has spent money on upgrades because nobody has that kind of money. He moves quietly. He buys 3 or 4 properties, sometimes through shell companies so the sellers don't realize until later who they sold to. He gets enough of a footprint to qualify the area for a redevelopment designation under state statute. Then he goes to the remaining holdouts and makes them an offer. It's always framed as generosity. It never is. I asked her what happened to the people who said no. She picked up her wine glass, looked at it, set it down without drinking. He finds their weak spots, she said. Zoning complaints, HOA violations, building code issues that were never issues before, insurance audits. It's never illegal. He knows exactly where the legal line is because he has 6 attorneys whose job is to know exactly where that line is and stay half a step behind it. I asked her if anyone had ever successfully pushed back. She was quiet for a moment. There was one family in Buckhead, she said finally. 4 years ago. He went after their property for 8 months. They fought every angle. cost them $40,000 in legal fees. At the end of it, they kept their house, but they were so financially and emotionally exhausted that they sold it 6 months later anyway, to Shaw Realty. At the original offer price, I looked at my wine glass. I filed the name Derek Shaw in the part of my brain where I kept information I did not yet know the use for. That was 8 months before the envelope. 6 months before he bought the property directly to my north. 5 months before he bought the 2 flanking properties on either side. 4 months before the gray Nissan appeared at the end of Elm Drive, with its rotating pair of drivers who thought they were being subtle. By the time Derek Shaw knocked on my door for the first time, I had been studying him for 3 months. I knew the names of his 6 attorneys. I knew which county commissioner he had donated to in the last election cycle, and what he had received in return. I knew the structure of the shell companies he used to acquire properties without revealing his identity to sellers. I knew the name of the federal infrastructure grant program that was partially funding the Elm Drive redevelopment project, and I knew the specific requirements that program imposed on developers regarding affordable housing units. And I knew, because I had read the grant application that Shaw Realty had submitted, that the number of affordable units they had promised the federal government was not the same number that appeared in the actual development plans. I knew all of this before he knocked on my door with his 2 attorneys and his legal folder and his handshake that was 1 degree too firm, the handshake of a man who has been told that firmness signals strength and has never questioned whether the people who told him that were right. He sat at my kitchen table and explained the situation to me in the patient, measured tone of someone who has explained the same situation many times, and watched the person on the other side of the table gradually understand that the explanation was not really an explanation. It was a notification. He told me the offer was fair. He told me the project would benefit the community. He showed me a rendering of what the development would look like. All glass and clean lines and a small plaza with benches where, in the rendering, attractive young people sat in dappled sunlight looking pleased with their lives. He told me the 30-day timeline was firm, that his attorneys had already begun preparing the court filing for acquisition by eminent domain under community development statute, that the process would be unpleasant and expensive for me if it proceeded that far. He said all of this while his son Vincent sat in the chair beside him and said nothing, which was almost more unsettling than anything Derek said, because Vincent was not performing the way his father was performing. Vincent was watching. He had the eyes of someone who had learned to read a room before deciding how to use it, and he was reading me. And I could see from the small stillness around his mouth that he was not entirely sure what he was reading. I offered them coffee. I let Derek talk. When he finished, I said I would need time to review the offer with my own attorney. Derek Shaw smiled the smile of a man who has heard that sentence many times and knows what it means. It means yes, he said. They just don't know it yet. After they left, I stood at the kitchen window and watched their cars pull away from the curb. Then I went to the drawer with the false bottom, and I took out the black notebook and I opened it to the first page and I began to write. The pressure started 4 days after Derek's first visit, which told me the timeline was tighter than he had presented it. If he had genuinely believed 30 days was a comfortable margin, he would have waited at least a week before applying secondary pressure. The fact that he started in 4 days meant the grant funding had a deadline he had not mentioned, and the court filing process was slower than he had implied. I noted this in the notebook. The first pressure was the insurance call. A representative from my homeowner's insurance company, friendly and apologetic, explaining that they were conducting a routine review of certain policies in the Atlanta metro area, and would I mind providing some additional documentation regarding the structural assessments of the property. When I asked which specific documentation, the representative named items that would require hiring a licensed inspector and potentially a structural engineer at my expense, within a time frame that would consume most of my 30 days. I thanked her. I asked, very gently, whether this review was something they were conducting across the board, or whether it had been triggered by a specific inquiry. There was a pause. She said she was not able to share that information. I thanked her again and said I would follow up with the necessary documentation. I wrote the insurance company's name in the notebook and drew a line connecting it to Derek Shaw's name. The bank called the following day. A loan officer explaining that my mortgage file had been flagged for a periodic compliance review and they would need updated income verification documents within 2 weeks. I asked which department had flagged it. He named a department I had not interacted with in 6 years of holding the mortgage. I said I would provide the documents. I wrote the bank's name in the notebook. On the third day, Mia came home from school and told me that a man had spoken to her at the school gate during afternoon pickup. He had been very friendly, she said. He had asked her what her mom did for work, whether her mom traveled a lot, whether her mom had a lot of friends in the neighborhood. I sat down across from my daughter at the kitchen table. I looked at her face, the careful way she was watching me to gauge whether she should be worried. I kept my expression calm and interested, the way you keep a surface flat, so the person on the other side of it can see their reflection clearly. Was he scary? I asked. She thought about it. No, she said. He was nice, but he asked a lot of questions for someone who said he was just saying hello. I told her that was very good noticing. I told her that if he or anyone like him spoke to her again at school, she should tell her teacher immediately. I told her she had done exactly the right thing by telling me. After she went upstairs to do her homework, I sat at the kitchen table for approximately 90 seconds. Not to think. I had already thought through what I would do in this situation 3 weeks ago, when I first understood what Derek Shaw's campaign was going to look like. I sat for 90 seconds, because 90 seconds was the amount of time I had learned, over 14 years of work that required me to remain functional under pressure, to allow myself to feel something before setting it aside to do what needed to be done. What I felt was a cold, clean, specific fury of the kind that does not express itself as heat. It expresses itself as clarity. It sharpens the edges of everything and makes decisions very simple. After 90 seconds, I picked up my phone and called Grace. Grace had been expecting my call, which told me she had been tracking Shaw Realty's moves around my property more closely than she had let on during our Sunday afternoon conversations. She did not ask me why I was calling or express surprise at anything I told her. She listened. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I found something last month, and I was waiting to see if it became relevant. I told her it had become relevant. She told me about the federal grant, the infrastructure program, the gap between the affordable housing commitment in the application and the units in the actual development plan. She had found it by accident, she said, while cross-referencing the development application with the grant program requirements as part of due diligence on a different project she was working on. The gap was not subtle, she said. 16 affordable units promised in the federal application. 0 in the development schematics. Either someone at Shaw Realty had made an error so large and so specific that it was difficult to believe it was an error, or someone at Shaw Realty had decided that the federal grant office would not cross-reference their application against the development plans. That is not a zoning violation, I said. No, Grace said. It is not. We were both quiet for a moment, understanding what we were looking at. I told her to document everything she had and send it to me securely. I gave her a method she did not ask questions about. Then I asked her to keep researching the grant program, specifically whether it had a federal oversight office, and whether that office had an investigative division. It does, she said. I already looked. I had spent 14 years working with people who did not waste time on information that was not already partially prepared. Grace had been a real estate attorney for 9 years, and she had never once called me surprised. I told her I loved her. She told me to be careful. After I hung up, I opened the black notebook and turned to the page I had been building for 3 weeks. The map was almost complete. I had the pressure campaign on one side, documented and time-stamped. I had the grant discrepancy on the other side, sourced and verifiable. In the middle, I had a question I had been working toward for 3 weeks, which was not how to stop Derek Shaw, because stopping him was not the point. Stopping him would take lawyers and time and money, and it would leave him intact and capable of redirecting toward someone with fewer resources to resist him. The question I had been working toward was how to make Derek Shaw stop himself. People like Derek Shaw do not stop because someone fights them. They stop because the cost-benefit calculation shifts. They stop because continuing becomes more expensive than retreating. I had spent 14 years watching governments and criminal organizations and financial institutions make the same calculation, and I had spent 14 years learning how to change the inputs on one side of the equation without the subject understanding that the inputs were being changed until the moment the calculation completed and the answer came back. Wrong. I wrote 3 items at the bottom of the last page of the notebook. I put a check mark next to the first item. I closed the notebook. The community meeting was Derek Shaw's mistake, though it did not look like a mistake from the outside. From the outside, it looked like a confident, well-funded developer presenting a polished vision to a neighborhood that would, one hoped, be grateful for the vision and manageable in its resistance. He had done community meetings before. He knew how they worked. You brought good renderings and credible numbers, and you spoke the language of investment and growth and community benefit, and you let the few people who were going to object, and you smiled at them with the patient benevolence of someone who knows the outcome is not actually in question, and then you moved forward. He rented the community center on a Wednesday evening. He hired a graphic design firm to produce the presentation materials. He had a moderator, a smooth-voiced man in a well-cut suit who was very skilled at the art of making a predetermined outcome feel like a facilitated discussion. I arrived early and sat in the third row, slightly left of center. I chose that seat because it gave me a clear sight line to the room entrance, the side exits, the presentation screen, and Derek Shaw's face when he was not looking at the audience. People reveal more when they think no one is watching them specifically. I had spent a significant portion of my career watching people who thought no one was watching them specifically. The presentation was good. It was genuinely well made, and I gave Derek Shaw credit for understanding that the aesthetics of a presentation function as an argument independent of its content. The rendering of the finished development was beautiful in the aspirational way of all architectural renderings, full of implied community and improved lives, and the specific visual warmth that graphic designers insert into illustrations of places that do not yet exist. He talked about green space and improved infrastructure and a new community center. He talked about tax revenue for the school district. He talked about job creation during the construction phase. He did not talk about the affordable housing units he had promised the federal government. I sat in the third row and I listened and I watched. And 40 minutes into the presentation, Vincent Shaw walked through the side door and took a seat against the wall. And I understood that he had not been in the main entrance because he had not wanted me to see him arrive. I had seen him arrive. He had come from the parking lot entrance 12 minutes before the meeting started. I had been in my seat for 45 minutes by then. 30 minutes later, Vincent stood up from his chair along the wall, and in the polished voice of a man performing spontaneity, he said that he had a question. He introduced himself as a concerned resident of the neighborhood, which was technically accurate since he had recently registered a mailing address at one of his father's properties on Elm Drive. He asked whether it was true that some of the holdout property owners had outstanding financial irregularities that might affect their standing in any legal proceedings. He did not say my name. He did not need to. 40 people in that room had their eyes on me within 3 seconds. I did not move. I did not change my expression. I felt 40 sets of eyes the way you feel a weather change, a shift in pressure against the skin, and I sat completely still. And I let the moment exist without reacting to it because reaction was what Vincent was engineering for, and giving someone what they engineer for is the same as handing them a weapon you built yourself. After a beat of silence, I smiled. Not at Vincent, at the moderator. I said, in the pleasant, clear voice of a woman who has nothing in particular to defend, that was a very interesting question, and probably worth the moderator clarifying the legal process for the benefit of everyone in the room. The moderator, who had not been briefed on this particular line of questioning, did his best. He said something procedural and mildly incoherent. Derek Shaw smiled from the podium. Vincent sat back down. The meeting continued. I noted 3 things before I left. I noted which 2 neighbors laughed a little too quickly at one of Derek Shaw's jokes, which suggested they were already in conversation with him. I noted that the moderator checked his phone twice during a part of the presentation he should have been paying attention to, which suggested he was waiting for a message from someone who was not in the room. And I noted that when Derek Shaw thought no one was watching him, during a section of the presentation where the graphic designer's animation was running and everyone else was looking at the screen, he looked directly at me with an expression that contained no smile at all. It was the expression of a man who was certain he had already won, and was wondering why winning did not feel more like winning. I stood outside the community center afterward in the cooling evening air, and Derek Shaw found me before I reached my car. He was not performing the polished developer anymore. The version of Derek Shaw that stood in front of me in the parking lot was something closer to the true version, stripped of the presentation layer by the specific confidence of a man who believed the audience had gone home. He told me the offer was real, and the timeline was real, and my resistance was costing both of us something. He told me I did not have the resources to fight him in court, and we both knew it. He told me the sensible thing, the adult thing, was to take the money and find another house and let the process move forward. I looked at him. I looked at the particular quality of certainty in his face, the way it sat on him like something structural rather than emotional. built not from arrogance in the moment but from a long history of being right. He had done this many times. He had always been right. There was no reason, in his model of the world, that this time should be different. That is the thing about people who have never been genuinely outmatched. They believe their record is evidence of their ability. It is not. It is evidence of who they have met so far. I said to him, "The interesting thing about men who are certain they have won is that they always tell you exactly what they are afraid of." He looked at me. I said, "If you were actually certain, you would not be in this parking lot." I walked to my car. I drove home. I sat in the driveway for a moment with the engine off, and I thought about the 3 items in the notebook and the 2 check marks and the one that was still waiting, and I thought about what the 3rd item was going to cost, and whether I was willing to pay it. I had known the answer to that question since the morning Mia told me a man had been asking questions about me at her school gate. I went inside. I helped Mia with her math homework. I made dinner. I waited. 3 days after the community meeting, Derek Shaw filed the court petition for eminent domain acquisition. Grace called me the morning the filing appeared in the court system. Her voice was careful in the way that lawyers' voices get careful when they are managing information that has bad edges. She told me the filing was procedurally solid. She told me challenging it would cost between $15,000 and $40,000 in legal fees over 6 to 18 months, with no guarantee of the outcome. I told her I was not going to challenge it. She was quiet for a moment. "Claire," she said. "I know," I said. "Trust me." Another pause. She had known me for 38 years. She had grown up watching me disassemble problems and rebuild them in configurations that made more sense. She did not always understand the method. She had learned to trust the outcomes. "Okay," she said. I told her to submit the documentation she had found regarding the grant discrepancy to the Federal Housing Finance Agency's Office of Inspector General. I gave her a specific contact name and office address. I told her to file it as a formal whistleblower complaint under the Federal False Claims Act, which would trigger a mandatory investigation and, more importantly, an automatic hold on any federal funds associated with the project under review. Grace was quiet for a longer moment. "Where did you get that contact name?" she asked. I did not answer that question directly. I told her to file it by end of business Thursday. She filed it by noon Thursday. Friday morning, the Federal Housing Finance Agency's Office of Inspector General opened a formal inquiry into the grant application submitted by Shaw Realty Group for the Elm Drive redevelopment project. By federal regulation, all property transactions associated with a project under active federal inquiry were subject to an automatic administrative hold pending the outcome of the investigation. The eminent domain petition was frozen. Derek Shaw's attorney called my phone at 2:17 on Friday afternoon. I did not answer. He left a voicemail that was 6 minutes long and carefully worded in the particular way of attorneys whose clients have just done something expensive. But I could hear, beneath the careful wording, the specific vibration of a man who has just been informed that the floor he was standing on is not as solid as his client told him it was. I listened to the voicemail twice. I deleted it. I made a note in the notebook. The 2nd item on the last page now had a check mark. The 3rd item was the one that cost something. I had known since the beginning of the notebook that the administrative hold would not be enough on its own. Derek Shaw had resources and relationships that a federal investigation would inconvenience but not destroy. He had 6 attorneys. He had a state senator who had taken his donations. He had the kind of patient, well-funded stubbornness that comes from never having been made to stop before. He would work around the hold. He would restructure the project, refile the grant application, adjust the development plans, change the shell company structure. It would cost him time and money, and it would be genuinely unpleasant. But unpleasant and over are not the same thing. For it to be over, the cost-benefit calculation had to shift completely. Not on the Elm Drive project specifically. On Derek Shaw's capacity to continue operating at scale. The 3rd item in the notebook was a phone number. Not a number I had used in 6 years. Not a number stored in my phone, because I do not store numbers like that in places where phones go. It was a number I kept in the same place I kept the black notebook, in the false bottom of the kitchen drawer behind the takeout menus, written in the inside cover of a paperback novel that looked entirely unremarkable on a shelf. I took the book from the shelf the night after Grace filed the complaint. I sat at the kitchen table after Mia was asleep, and I looked at the number for a long time. The number belonged to a man named Walter Reese. Walter had been the head of economic intelligence analysis at the agency for 11 of the 14 years I worked there. He was 63 years old and had not worked for the government in 4 years, and spent his retirement consulting for 3 organizations whose names were not on any public list. Walter knew more about the way money moved through the intersections of private development, government contracting, and institutional investment than anyone I had ever met, and more importantly, he knew the people who sat at those intersections and had opinions about the things that happened there. I had called Walter for professional reasons many times during my career. I had never called him for a personal reason. I understood that making this call would mean explaining to Walter why I was making it, which would mean confirming for him 6 years after I left, where I was living, and under what circumstances. Walter was not a dangerous man. He was a careful one, which is different. But careful men have relationships with other careful men, and once information enters a network, it does not come back out. I was trading something for this, my privacy, or at least a piece of it. I decided the piece was worth trading. I dialed the number. Walter answered on the 3rd ring and said my name before I said anything, which meant either he still had my number in his system, or he had been tracking my number passively, both of which were the kind of thing I had learned not to be unsettled by when Walter Reese was involved. He asked how I was. I told him I was well. I asked how he was. He said he was retired, which was the answer he always gave, and which meant he was busier than he had ever been. We spent approximately 45 seconds on pleasantries, which was the appropriate amount of time before getting to the reason for a call that both parties already understood was not social. I told him about Derek Shaw. I told him about the Elm Drive project. I told him about the grant discrepancy and the administrative hold. I told him I needed to understand who had a material interest in Derek Shaw's continued operation, and whether any of those parties had a reason to prefer that he stop. Walter was quiet for a moment. The particular quality of his silence told me he was not thinking about whether he could help. He was deciding how to explain what he already knew. He told me that Shaw Realty had received significant funding from a private infrastructure investment fund over the past 4 years. The fund, which operated under a name that referred to nothing in particular, was a subsidiary of a larger investment vehicle that had holdings in 3 major defense contracting companies. Those holdings were not public knowledge, Walter said, but they were also not secret to the people who needed to know. The defense contractors had pending contract renewals coming up for review by the Federal Procurement Office. Any entity associated with them that attracted federal investigation attention was a compliance risk. The fund's general partners were, Walter said, very particular about compliance risk. I asked him if he knew anyone at the fund who had a relationship with Derek Shaw directly. He told me he knew the fund's managing director. He said the managing director was a practical person who did not enjoy unpleasant surprises. I asked Walter if he thought the managing director would be interested in knowing that one of the fund's portfolio relationships had attracted a federal inquiry. Walter said that in his experience, managing directors of funds with defense contractor exposure were always interested in knowing that kind of thing as early as possible. I said I understood. He said he would make a call. I thanked him. He said there was nothing to thank him for. We said goodbye. I sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes after the call. The house was quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming and, distantly, the sound of the oak tree moving in the wind outside the kitchen window. I opened the notebook to the last page. I looked at the 3rd item. I put the check mark next to it, then I closed the notebook and put it back in the false bottom of the drawer, and I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat at the kitchen table and thought about nothing in particular until I was ready to sleep. Derek Shaw called me at 9:15 the following Monday morning. Not his attorney, Derek himself. That was the first indication. Men who are confident call through their lawyers. Men who have just been informed that something structural has changed in their situation call directly. His voice was different from the voice he had used in my kitchen 3 weeks earlier. The performance layer was gone. What was underneath it was not panic. Exactly, because Derek Shaw had enough experience and enough resources that panic was not his first response to difficulty. What was underneath it was a kind of compressed, deliberate anger. The anger of a person who has identified who is responsible for what has happened to them and is deciding what register to use. He said he knew I had filed the complaint with the Federal Oversight Office. I said my attorney had filed a whistleblower complaint on the basis of documented evidence. I said that was my legal right. He said he was aware it was my legal right. He said he was calling to make very clear that whatever I thought I was doing, I did not understand who I was dealing with. I said I was probably right about that. A pause. He had not expected agreement. In my experience, agreement is the response people are least prepared for when they are attempting confrontation. He said that the administrative hold would be resolved. He said the project would move forward. He said the offer on my property was being withdrawn as of that conversation, and the eminent domain petition would be refiled as soon as the hold was lifted. I said I understood. He said he was going to find out who I really was and what I was really doing in that house, because nobody who worked as a freelance accountant knew how to navigate a federal whistleblower filing the way I had apparently navigated one. I said that was an interesting theory. He said he did not make threats. He made predictions. I said I had noticed that about him. He hung up. I set the phone down on the counter. I looked out the kitchen window. Mia was at school. The yard was empty. The oak tree was doing the thing it did in the morning when the light came through it at a particular angle, which was to make the whole backyard look like a place where nothing bad had ever happened or could. I felt something in my chest that took me a moment to identify, because I was not accustomed to feeling it anymore. It was something adjacent to peace. Not the peace of resolution, because nothing was resolved yet. The peace of a person who has done what they can and is waiting for physics to do the rest. The call from the investment fund's managing director to Derek Shaw happened on a Wednesday. I know this because Grace heard about it through a real estate attorney in Derek's circle who called her, not realizing she was on my side of this, to say that Shaw Realty was in serious internal discussions about the Elm Drive project and things were, in the attorney's words, not going well. I know the substance of what the managing director said because Walter told me afterward, in the brief, informational way that Walter communicated things he thought were relevant without editorializing. The managing director had explained to Derek Shaw that the fund could not maintain its investment position in any project associated with an active federal inquiry, particularly given the fund's exposure through its defense contractor holdings. She had given him 48 hours to provide a plan for resolving the inquiry that did not involve continuing to escalate the property acquisition that had triggered it. Derek Shaw had 48 hours to decide whether the Elm Drive project was worth more to him than the fund's continued investment in Shaw Realty. He called his attorney. His attorney spent one day reviewing the federal grant application and the development plans side by side and confirmed what Grace had found, which was that the discrepancy was real and substantial, and not the kind of thing that could be characterized as an administrative error. His attorney then explained to him, very carefully, that if the federal inquiry proceeded to a full investigation, and the discrepancy was confirmed, the potential penalties under the False Claims Act were significant, and the personal liability exposure for the principals of Shaw Realty was not negligible. Derek Shaw was a man who had spent 20 years bending rules without breaking them because he understood where the line was and stayed behind it. He had not understood that someone had moved the line. On the morning of the 48th hour, Derek Shaw called his 6 attorneys into a meeting and told them to stand down on the Elm Drive eminent domain petition. He authorized them to contact the Federal Oversight Office and initiate a voluntary disclosure process regarding the grant application discrepancy, which his attorneys strongly recommended as the fastest path to resolving the inquiry with the least possible personal exposure. Voluntary disclosure meant acknowledging the discrepancy. It meant restructuring the project to include the affordable housing units as originally committed. It meant reduced grant funding and reduced profit margins and a project timeline that was extended by approximately 18 months. It was not a catastrophic outcome for Shaw Realty. It was a deeply expensive, deeply humiliating outcome for Derek Shaw personally, which is a different thing, but, for a man whose identity is built on winning, a thing that cuts differently. Grace called me Thursday morning with the news. I was standing at the kitchen counter pouring coffee when she called. I set the pot down and listened, and when she finished, I said, "Thank you, Grace." She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I mean actually okay." I held the phone against my shoulder and looked out the window at the yard. The October light was doing the same thing it always did in the morning, moving slowly through the oak tree and settling across the grass in long pieces. In 2 hours, I would get in my car and drive to Mia's school and pick her up for early release day, and we had talked the night before about going to the farmer's market on Peachtree and then maybe getting ice cream, if it was not too cold, and it had been a small conversation. The kind of small conversation that is the actual substance of a life? And I had sat across from my daughter while she talked about it, and felt something I had been feeling more and more since we moved to the house on Elm Drive, and that I had never had a word for that fit exactly right. I told Grace I was actually okay. She was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed, soft and brief, the laugh of a woman who has been holding her breath for a month. She said she would come for dinner Sunday. I said I would make the pasta. She said she would bring the wine. We hung up. Vincent Shaw knocked on my door on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after his father stood down. He was alone. He was not wearing the corporate uniform I had seen him in at every other encounter, the dark suit and the air of someone performing a function. He was wearing jeans and a jacket, and he looked like a man in his late 20s who had spent several weeks thinking about something and had finally decided to do the thing that the thinking had been moving him toward. I opened the door. He said his father had withdrawn all claims on the property, and the eminent domain petition had been formally dismissed. He said the federal inquiry was ongoing, but his father had engaged cooperating counsel, and the voluntary disclosure process was underway. I told him I was aware of both of those things. He nodded. He looked at the doorframe for a moment rather than at me, and then he looked at me. He said, "I want to understand what happened." I looked at him. He was 28 years old, and he had grown up watching his father operate, and he had gone to work for his father's company, because that is what you do when you have grown up watching a person who is very certain and very successful operate, until the day you watch someone dismantle them in 31 days without raising her voice once, and you find yourself standing at the door of that person's house on a Saturday morning asking a question you are not sure you know how to ask. I opened the door wider. I said he could come in if he wanted coffee. He came in. He sat at the kitchen table. I poured 2 cups. Mia was upstairs at a friend's house, and the kitchen was quiet in the way it gets quiet on weekend mornings, when there is no particular urgency in either direction. He asked me what I did, what I actually did. I looked at my coffee cup. I thought about what to say and what not to say. There is a version of this answer that is satisfying and cinematic, and makes a good story. And there is a true version, which is that what I did, for 14 years, was understand how systems work, and find the specific point where a small, precise intervention would produce the largest possible effect, not because of any particular genius, but because of practice and patience, and the willingness to map a thing completely before acting on it rather than acting on the first angle that presented itself. I told Vincent that his father made a mistake that most people with significant resources make when they go after someone they believe has no resources. He assumed that the fight would happen on the terrain he chose, using the weapons he chose, at the time he chose. He brought lawyers and money and political relationships, and he aimed them at a property dispute. He did not consider the possibility that the person he was fighting had already mapped his operation from a different angle before he arrived. Vincent wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He said, "He didn't know who you were." I said, "He knew exactly who I presented myself as. That's different." Vincent was quiet for a moment. He said, "Why didn't you just fight the eminent domain petition directly? Lawyer up, go to court." I said, "Because court takes 18 months and $40,000, and even if I won, he still has his operation and he still has his methods, and he goes and does it to someone else on the next street over. I did not want to stop the petition. I wanted to change the calculation." Vincent looked at me. He said, "You wanted it to not be worth it for him." I said, "I wanted him to stop himself." He thought about that. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something in the distance and then stopping, barking and stopping, in the irregular rhythm of a dog who has not decided whether the thing is worth sustained attention. Vincent said, "He's not a bad man. I want to be clear that I'm not saying that to defend him. He's not a good man either. He's a man who learned one way of operating and got very good at it, and it worked for a very long time, and he never had any reason to examine it." I said, "Most people don't examine what's working." He said, "Is that what you did? Examine what was working?" I said, "I examined what he thought was working, and why he thought it, and where the gap was between what he thought and what was actually true." Vincent looked at his coffee cup for a long moment. When he looked up, his expression was something I had not seen on his face in any of the previous encounters, which was the expression of a person who has arrived at something they could not have arrived at without going through the thing that just happened to them. He said, "I don't want to do what he does." I said I knew. He asked how I knew. I said, "Because you've been working for him for 4 years and you've never once let yourself become the front of it. You always stayed one step back. Men who want to do what their fathers do step forward. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he picked up his coffee and finished it, and set the cup down, and thanked me for the coffee and for the conversation. He stood up. At the door he turned back and said, "I'm sorry for the school gate. The questions they asked Mia." I looked at him. I said, "That one cost you." He nodded. He knew. He left. I stood at the door for a moment after his car pulled away. Then I went to the kitchen drawer and opened it and reached to the false bottom and took out the black notebook. I opened it to the last page. I looked at the 3 items and the 3 check marks for a long moment. Then I tore the page out. I folded it twice. I went to the back door and stepped out into the October yard, and I stood under the oak tree in the morning light, and I tore the page into small pieces, and I let them fall into the garden bed at the base of the fence, where the soil was dark and soft from the rain the week before. I stood there for a while. The light moved through the tree above me, in the slow, specific way it moved through that particular tree, which I had been watching from this particular angle for 6 years, long enough to know the way the morning settled into the yard like something patient and particular to this place, this fence, this ground. Mia would be home in 2 hours. I went inside to start the pasta. Before I tell you what kind of woman I am, let me tell you what I am not. I am not someone who fought Derek Shaw because I enjoy fighting. I am not someone who outmaneuvered him because I wanted to prove something about who I used to be, or what I used to do. I left that world because I understood, on a specific flight home from a city I cannot name, that winning at the highest level of that world cost something that could not be replenished, and I was no longer willing to pay it. What I am is someone who built a life in a house with an oak tree in a backyard where a 10-year-old girl talks to caterpillars on Tuesday mornings. And when a man with money and lawyers and 20 years of unbroken winning came to tell me that life was not mine to keep, I did what I was trained to do. Not because of instinct, not because of ego, because the life I built is worth the specific effort it takes to protect it. Because Mia deserves to know that the ground she stands on is not subject to another person's calculation of its value. Derek Shaw looked at my house and saw an asset. He looked at me and saw a woman without resources. He was right about one thing. The most dangerous thing I ever learned to do was make people believe I was nobody. He found out what nobody looks like when it decides you are the problem it was designed to solve. Outside on Elm Drive, the leaves are starting to turn, the oaks going amber and the maples going red, and Mia is in the backyard again this morning, not with a caterpillar this time, but with a sketchbook, drawing the fence and the garden and the oak tree with the careful, slow attention of a person who understands that some things are worth taking the time to see exactly right. I am standing at the kitchen window with my coffee. I am watching her. I am home.